All right. Hello, Ms. Irina. Patrick Walsh. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you for joining and accepting our humble invitation in the first place. Please do excuse me. I may have troubles with my sound because I have just recovered from an illness. Maybe can be some problems with my voice. So, okay. And I just want to introduce you first. So, first in my own language. Salamlar, hepinizi xoş gördük. Bugünkü webinarımızda qonaqlarımız Irina Tsukerman və Patrick Walshdır. Deməli, Irina xanım Amerikalı vəkil və Patrick Walsh isə İrlandiyalı tarixçidir. Mən də həmişə kimi moderatorunuz Qarabağ Azərbaycan üzvü. Bugün normaldan biraz daha həyəcanlıyam çünki xəstəlikdən təzə çıxmışam. Ümid edirəm biraz bağışlayarsınız. So now in English, let's introduce you. Our guests today are Irina Tsukerman, the American lawyer, advisor of the Supreme Council of the London-based International Justice Organization, and Patrick Walsh, the Irish historian and Caucasus expert. Nice to meet you here. How are you?
Doing well.
I suppose.
Very well, thank you. Examinas here.
That sounds good. Okay, that's nice. That's great. Before I get into more details about our questions and questionnaires, I just want to ask a couple of questions that could be a little bit personal. Mr. Walsh, how you got acquainted with entire Azerbaijan, this Qarabağ deal, and the entire region at all?
I suppose it's a long story, but to try and cut it a little bit shorter, I was invited in 2018 to Baku by the Academy of Sciences for the centenary of the March events, and I did a talk and a presentation, and I spent a week in Azerbaijan. Previously, I had written about the Ottoman Empire and the First World War, so I had and also the Armenian issue, and this is where the invite came from. But I'd never been to Azerbaijan before, and I was very impressed. And really, the information that I got on the visit inspired me to start writing and studying the region a lot more. And so I ended up writing a 900-page book on the geopolitics of the Caucasus, really from around about the turn of the 20th century. And that's really where my interest came from.
That's good to hear. What about you, Irina?
Well, I was born in Ukraine myself when it was still the Soviet Union. My father had actually served in Azerbaijan back in the day. So, of course, I had a familiarity with the region on a personal level from being from the general vicinity and from following these events. But I also started engaging culturally with Azerbaijanis a few years ago. In 2018, I traveled to Azerbaijan, not just to Baku, but to all over the country with a mission with a cultural organization called American Sephardi Federation. And during the course of the trip, we also had an opportunity to see Georgian Marjanli at the time. And we kind of got a firsthand experience of what the conflict was about, because we were a civilian group visiting with the civilians who lived in the area. And when we came too close to the front line, the Armenian snipers on the other side actually started pointing and mobilizing in our direction. We were unarmed. So I kind of started getting the sense of what it was all about. outside the media discussions and what we were told. And since then, I've written a number of articles on this issue. Currently, I'm also vice president of a media company called Timberwolf Phoenix, and we have a website called Republic Underground, where we've been encouraging voices from poorly or insufficiently or incorrectly covered conflicts to come forward to give voices to their own experiences. We've also been covering this conflict very extensively and going beyond the circumstances of current events, also exploring history to the best of our abilities and encouraging historians and others to share the insights to get an in-depth understanding of Caucasus. We are now also creating a network of journalists interested in the region and in related topics called the Caucasus Journalist Network. So we've already had a first meeting, and another one is coming up next week. So we are quite involved as well.
Very nice. Speaking of articles, I mean, both of you had extensive research on that matter, and especially Patrick Walsh's blog actually covered a lot about the conflict itself and its aftermath. I have read a couple of your articles, and I really liked your point of view, like how you proposed a joint, how do I say this, resettlement project of both Azerbaijans and Armenians, and you proposed this as a solution for long-term solution for this conflict. In all honesty, today our conversation would be more like a discussion topic that I will actually put forward something, and we trio together will discuss around this stuff. And as the name of it suggests, that current and future geopolitical changes, I first want to give open a topic about United States involvement in the entire conflict, just because Irina actually wrote an article with this, and it's a very obscure topic that no one actually covered a lot. So there's a kind of, I don't know how to call it, misconception or the misunderstanding that United States is largely ignoring the conflict, or is involved in more on the Armenian side because of the activities of the Armenian diaspora. And I want to get your thoughts on this matter. How do you think the United States are right now reacting?
Well, at the moment, the US is preoccupied with the transition. But shortly around the time of the election, the administration did try to pander a little bit to the Armenian diaspora. They made statements that could be interpreted as sympathetic to the Armenian experience without at the same time crossing the lines and attacking Azerbaijan specifically. There were some comments that were made that seemed to be one-sided, however, and were specifically addressed to Armenia rather than to the both parties. However, on a political level, on a policy level, Secretary of State Pompeo had actually met with both foreign ministers from both countries. I had an opportunity to hear from both of them. The US ultimately did not take any direct action to the conflict other than calling for both sides to return to a peace process, to discontinue active combat and the usual statements of that sort. They were also given within the context of the US role in the OSCE. The US, there was a comment made by senior officials concerning the so-called Syrian jihadists that were alleged to be fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh at the time, but they were careful not to overstep and not to make it seem like they had any more information than what was being reported by the media, and therefore no one actually called for any action with that regard or claimed to have real knowledge of that issue. Subsequently, of course, those jihadists or any evidence of them did not materialize on the Azerbaijani side, and that issue was not really actively pursued by the United States. With respect to the military issue, and the US has stayed out of it completely. They do not have a formal defense agreement with Azerbaijan, nor do they have a base of operations. In Azerbaijan, at the same time, they've had geopolitical concerns about Iran's involvement, about Russia's role. That's been a major concern to the administration and will continue to be a concern. There's been some latest tensions with Turkey, but that was not. But the general position of the US has been not to get actively involved in any military sense in the conflict, because there is no real victory for the US in this. There's no real reason to be involved, nor has anyone actually called for the US to be actively involved. In terms of the political issue, the biggest political outcome for this has been on the domestic side, due to extreme pressure from ANKA, which is an Armenian major and very influential Armenian lobby in the US. It has lobbied successfully in the past with members of Congress. There are specific members of Congress that typically parrot its positions and talking points in a very obviously one-sided way, which is not something that any administration would generally sign off on, even if they were typically more sympathetic to one side or the other. This is specific members of Congress who've engaged in this rhetoric. They've lobbied for financial assistance to the people, to the so-called Artsakh activists, but ultimately they've asked for very large amounts of money. Secretary of Pompeo did pledge money in humanitarian aid to the Armenians who were leaving the Nagorno-Karabakh region, and but we don't know what is actually going to happen in terms of that humanitarian aid, given that this is perceived to be an outgoing administration, and frankly, right now the priorities in the U.S. are domestic, related to coronavirus recovery and other issues rather than foreign aid in general. So while those pledges were made, it does not really mean the makeup of Congress that is supposed to approve this aid and is so far not 100% determined either, which creates an additional political complication. On the Azerbaijani side, there has not been an active political call by Azerbaijan for any specific action on the part of the United States, other than further engagement on various issues and so forth. There hasn't been an active push for sanctions against any specific Armenian officials or groups. There's been some calls from the small Azerbaijani diaspora to investigate Ankan-related matters, and there's been complaints about physical attacks on Azerbaijani demonstrators in various cities around the country, and these investigations are ongoing, and they have been condemned by various officials in the United States. But overall, on the political side, Azerbaijan has not been overtly pushing the U.S. for anything concrete, and the U.S. has not been motivated to engage in this beyond these issues without any specific push from its counterparts, as generally this works outside some major conflicts directly related to U.S. interest. U.S. does have an interest in the energy issue. Concerning Azerbaijan, there is a potential for U.S.-backed pipeline that may be in the works in the future, depending on how things end up working out with the Naxçıvana corridor. But outside of that, and they're also happy whenever there is something that blocks Russia and Iran from benefiting from energy exports to Europe. So in that sense, the US does have a stake in a stable Azerbaijan that is able to convey energy effectively. But that is not something that is generally becomes an issue of much public discussion. This is something that happens in the meeting on a foreign minister, secretary of state level, and security discussions, not generally a big headline holder outside the events of the war, when there was an information war going on in the papers, and a few outlets did examine this issue. It's not something that is prioritized in the media or in political statements, U.S. officials.
Oh, thank you, Ms. Irina, for such an extensive answer to the question. Mr. Patrick, do you have anything?
Yeah, well, I was listening to a web conference there yesterday, which featured a few Americans talking about this very topic. Matthew Bryzo was prominent in the conference. I know Matthew, he's obviously was ambassador to Azerbaijan and an interlocutor in the Minsk group. And he's obviously a very knowledgeable, perceptive man. And it's really a big pity that Matthew Bryzo isn't in charge of American foreign policy in the South Caucasus, although I don't think the Armenians would be too happy about that. But, he has extensive knowledge, and, he was saying things on the line that, the war has actually been a great opportunity for the West and actually NATO to an extent. But, it won't be seizing this opportunity because essentially, no, he wasn't saying this, but he was saying it presented a big opportunity, especially with Turkey's increasing influence in the region as a result of the war. Obviously, Americans see things very much in terms of, conflict with Russia, conflict with Iran. And so in certain ways, he was answering a question that about whether Russia had actually scored a victory in this conflict. And he was saying it shouldn't really be looked like that. But I think, he hit the nail on the head, as we say in Ireland, in what he was saying, because the problem really lies with America's attitude to Turkey, I think. And, generally, while President Trump had a reasonably good relationship with President Putin and even President Erdogan, I don't know. I haven't got such an optimistic view of what President Biden might be like. President Biden, just before the election, issued a statement which was really pretty terrible about a humanitarian disaster occurring in Karabakh, and basically that the Azerbaijan advance had to be stopped. And this was obviously really probably came about because of Armenian voices in his ear, but it was so out of kilter, out with reality, that it was unbelievable, because anybody who'd followed the war saw there was no humanitarian disaster occurring, and essentially it was the only mechanism by which the conflict would be given a chance of an enduring settlement. So Biden was completely wrong in this. I think there's probably the big problem, I think, that confronts America is its poor relationship with Turkey. I mean, America is driving Turkey towards the east. And this is a problem, essentially, for everybody, because, obviously it's a strengthening relationship between Turkey and Moscow. And in fact, this conflict has, to a certain extent, done that as well. And, the Americans really have been left on the sidelines. They haven't really contributed anything really positive to the conflict. The Minsk group failed largely, and some people would say completely. And American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, particularly with the Iraq War, has been a real disaster, essentially. And it's not quite clear what is in store, but I can still see America, unless it really, engages in the spirit of what Matthew Bryzo represents. Unless it engages in that spirit in the region, I think it will continue to be on the sidelines, and we'll just look rather jealously at Russia's influence in the area. And despite what Mr. Bryzo says, it has an opportunity, but I cannot see it really taking it in the near future, especially as what Irina was saying. It's in a transition. It's got a very bad COVID-19 problem. And, it really is in a very difficult spot at the present minute.
Well, we are saying that the Trump administration was a little light on Turkey, but last week they have accepted the CAATSA sanctions, and that's happening under Trump administration still now. So what's this big change? What's this radical change? Why suddenly they implemented a CAATSA? It's one of the highest possible sanctions that they can do. It's basically a sanction against direct enemies of America, like Iran, Russia, and North Korea. I think only 3 countries so far had been implemented this sanction. Now Turkey. So what's happening?
Well, I mean, it's it's obviously to do with the air defense system, the S-400 purchases. Turkey needs this system, and the Americans are not willing to sell it to Turkey. So, it's a bit like Azerbaijan's position. Azerbaijan purchased its weapons largely from Russia, from Israel, from Turkey. The Americans can't really complain about this because they're obviously Congress is blocking weapons sales, and for various reasons, to do with lobbies, to do with the general conditions of American politics, which is very much driven by interest groups and lobbies in Washington, and really this disables American foreign policy.
We can just say
in the region.
Modern corruption.
Well, I think it was John F. Kennedy said that Congress was the best assembly that money could buy. He said that cynically, and but it's right. I mean, that's how America works. Its politics works like that, and America's been driving, and the EU have been driving Turkey eastwards for the last couple of decades, and really, this is a big problem. If for anybody who wants to, extend Western influence in the South Caucasus, it's a very, very big problem. And the Armenian diaspora, both in France and America, present big problems for anybody in Azerbaijan who wants to, obviously have better relations with the West and have more Western input. I think that the problems for Azerbaijan and Turkey are external. They're basically produced by the Western powers. It's not. I think Turkey, and Azerbaijan naturally want to look westwards. There's large sections of the population that have great favor with the West, but American foreign policy and the EU's policy is definitely not accommodating that at all.
I would disagree with the assessment that Azerbaijan or Turkey or any other country merely do not have any autonomous decision-making except to respond to Western moves one way or the other. I think that politics of any given country is always complicated and has to balance different interests. Azerbaijan, for instance, is surrounded by 3 major powers and has to balance between the interests of having to deal with its immediate neighbors, as well as its own inclinations to maintain good relations with the West. Turkey has always had a complicated political history. It has had strong French influences. At the same time, its own Eastern Asian, Middle Eastern influence cannot be completely discounted. I think it would be a mistake to pretend that Turkey had a one-way approach to the entire time. It has been a strong U.S. ally for many years, but at the same time, it had complicated internal dynamics that should not be dismissed. It had a period of time under the Kemalist influence where it was perceived as a secularist, but nevertheless it was not fully Western liberal in the same sense that European countries and the US are perceived that way. It had religious elements inside the country that were sort of struggling against that political philosophy. Right now, Erdogan is certainly sending very mixed messages, to put it mildly. I believe that this particular sanction was not just directly related to the purchase of the Russian weapons, because other countries have purchased similar weapons, if not that particular version. It's rather a message towards Erdogan's particular mode of behavior with respect to his regional role as a member of NATO, that he is being perceived as an aggressor towards other NATO members and disruptive to the US role in the region in that way. So while you can ask the question why the administration chose that particular mode of sanction to address a broader geopolitical problem, when the problem is obviously not just in those weapons purchased, as I said, by other states, but rather in a larger political issues and differences. One would say it's probably a message that, your role is supposed to be a member of the NATO, but you're getting a little too close to Russia. You're sending us a message that we are supposedly driving you eastward, but you are choosing to engage with Russia on more than just weapon sales. You are choosing to engage with them in dividing up territory in Syria. You are engaging with them in certain interesting ways, I should say. In Libya, we don't know what's going on, but we don't like it. I think that's the message in general. It's not a message specifically geared narrowly towards weapons purchases as much as to the general and increasingly complicated role Turkey is playing as a NATO member.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Patrick, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I'd agree with what Irina said there. It is a more complex issue than just weapons, air defense systems. I mean, it's been going on for quite a few years now. And obviously, I think, without going into the Syrian conflict in detail, I think that's been a very complicating factor in all of this, Obviously, there's been a lot of there was a lot of things we don't really know what was going on in Syria. And obviously, Turkey decided, or President Erdogan decided, to look after his state interests in a certain way. Whether that was wise or not, I think it's very debatable, but by intervening in Syria. But essentially, the progression of events that occurred in Syria had a big effect, really, on relations between the United States and Turkey and also in Russia. So it's quite a complex situation, and also it's obviously been made more complicated by events in Libya, as Irina said, and other issues as well. Turkey has to balance itself. It can't become too dependent on either side. That's the lesson of its history, really. And when it's lost the ability to balance itself, it's found itself in trouble. Unfortunately, during the Cold War, things were very much easier for Turkey because it had a friend and it had an enemy. It was a member of NATO, and it was very much praised for its activities, particularly in Korea, and it had very good relations with the Americans during the Cold War, during the 50s and 60s. But, with the end of the Cold War, things became much more fluid. And, the Americans, some commentator once said that, you need an enemy in the world to orientate yourself, to have good decision making. But I think once one of the paradoxes of the end of the Cold War is that the Americans lost something to orientate against, and it tried to sort of orientate itself against Islamic fundamentalism after 9/11, but this complicated things drastically, and it really can't really work out what its proper orientation in the world at the present minute. Is, for instance, Russia the enemy? Is China the enemy? There's different viewpoints in America about this. I think Trump felt very much that China was the enemy. I think Biden is more orientated towards seeing Russia as an enemy. So, this is a complicated story, and it's multifaceted from all countries' positions. So, yes, it's complex. It's very, very complex.
Ms. Irina, you have told about a possible pipeline through the Sunni line that passes through Naxçıvana that goes to that the United States might be interested in. So there are currently top and Tama pipelines that are passing through Azerbaijan and going through Georgia and going to the Europe. So, I mean, British interests are on the place. I mean, they own a larger portion of it. That's understandable. The United States should ideally be concerned about European Union's energy security, right? And with them, France as well. So what is happening with France? Why France is putting, I mean, clearly somehow jeopardizing its situation of the European Union by saying and openly supporting the separatist regimes. Not to mention, France itself has a separatist problems, although not in the larger scale, but still.
Well, France has been trying to essentially play another world power and to return to the international scene. That in general means meandering between various different interests and playing them off one another to its own particular advantage, but it also has tried to curry favor as an anti-Islamist champion in Europe, which is understandable given that it is a significant problem in Europe and within its own borders. However, its positions have been rather contradictory. On the one hand, it has turned the Azerbaijan-Armenian territorial conflict into some sort of a proxy war between France and Turkey, even though doing so actually empowers Turkey by making Azerbaijan closer to Turkey and more defensive on these issues rather than actually trying to deny Turkey that level of political influence and try to be more diplomatic in the way in its handling any mediation efforts. I thought that was not a very smart move in terms of what France is pursuing for its own sake. On the other hand, it has claimed to be combating Islamists and so forth. On the other hand, its economy is extremely dependent on Qatar, and it has no shortage of Turkish preachers from the more extreme end and Islamists and so forth in its mosques, which it has not pursued in cleaning up. And when other countries offered assistance, it has rejected them. It accepted some symbolic arrangement with Morocco, but has also not been particularly aggressive about implementing it. In terms of African colonies, it has been working with Qatar and to some extent in some areas. It has had issues with Turkey in Libya, and but not because it's so concerned about the spread of Islamism or Turkey's political concerns, but because of its own interest in maintaining a semi-colonial presence in that country. So it has been open to political arrangements there. So Macron is not being really honest about what he's doing and why he's doing that. He's claiming he's fighting ideological battles, which are entirely geopolitical and France's territorial interest rather than any real position on any issue of principle. That is why none of it is really playing out in any clear way, and he's essentially using the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict for his own interests as well. Now, France also has a very big and influential Armenian diaspora, so that should not be discounted, but Macron is also trying to position himself as a world leader and as someone who's sending a message to the entire European Union that he's tough on Turkey, and so forth. And that's actually what's driving his strange rhetoric. It's counterproductive. I see it nothing more than political virtue signaling. He was forced to admit repeatedly he has no enforcement mechanisms beyond these comments. He also had to admit publicly that that France recognizes the UN resolutions on this issue, and therefore, technically, from a legal standpoint, Azerbaijan is in the right. His comments, a lot of them were geared specifically towards Turkey and its alleged role in this situation. So you can't even take it as him actually being overly involved in the conflict itself, but it has denied itself, a more positive diplomatic role in that regard by not engaging in a way that a skillful diplomat would do to try to come to economic arrangements with Azerbaijan for France's interests, to try to essentially minimize influence by Russia and Turkey and Iran and third parties by having a greater role to play in Caucasus in general. I think it's a missed opportunity from that perspective, and I think Macron was thinking about it too narrowly in terms of what message he wants to say rather than just being good at actually implementing that particular type of policy.
Okay, Mr. Patrick, do you have that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with a lot of what Irina says there. You know, Macron, the problem with him really is the fact that France is, a member of the Minsk group as one of the chairs. So, really he needs to moderate his language and not appear to be partisan, because obviously that has an undermining effect on the Minsk group. If he's like this, France tends to have look at this from the Irish or British point of view. France tends to be quite a dogmatic secularist state. Britain would look at France and say, "Why are you doing this? This Charlie Hebdo stuff and this quite dogmatic secularism." Anybody who's say from Turkey who lives in the United Kingdom would see the difference between Britain and France. France looks at things very dogmatically. In a lot of sense, it's not really helpful. And in a sense, it produces an antagonism with Turkey. And, that's what a lot of this is really essentially about. And I think, Macron overstepped the mark with his statements, recognizing, Armenian separatism, and especially because France is obviously a signatory to the resolutions in 1993, and obviously being part of the Security Council. I mean, it's just completely inconsistent making statements like that, and it does no good for the standing of the Minsk group in further negotiations, really. So I don't think Macron did himself any favors at all in his actions and words.
What's interesting to me that I noticed that it kind of the High Assembly, General Assembly, the Council all accepted that, recommended that they should recognize the separatist states, and even Macron hinted at its possibility. And then comes the foreign ministers and the others, and they blatantly refuse everything and say that no, it's not the case, France will suffer from this decision or stuff like that. It kind of paints a picture that there is seemingly separation in their government, or is it?
Well, I mean, perhaps Macron is he's a type of politician a little bit on the sort of Donald Trump sort of lines. He came to power as a sort of an individual in a sense, so he's not integrated in a political base to the same extent as like normal politicians are in other countries. I think the other issue is to do with Brexit, the British exit from the European Union. Macron has found himself much more powerful within Europe as a result of Britain leaving the European Union. It's really the two most powerful countries now are obviously France and Germany. So he's, and I think he's conscious of his weight in the world, and he's acting a bit like a type of, I think there's a word for it that the Americans use. I'm trying to think what it is, but it's where basically you're a detached element from the overall system. You're acting as an individual rather than as a representative of your state. Tony Blair was a little bit like this when he was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, but Macron is really another example of this. And I think, the foreign ministers are obviously putting him right. They're saying, France has state interests. You're an individual. Can you please, understand that we have interests? We're not a vehicle for you. We are a state with historical relationships and interests in the world. So I think that's what a lot of it is about, really.
All right. So the question to both of you, now that the conflict is resolved, we can say it, what is the mission of Minsk Group anyway? Why it exists and when it will be disbanded and how it will be disbanded if disbanded?
Well, first of all, while the conflict appears to be resolved, I don't think it's a complete end of the story on Armenia's part, for that matter, or Russia's part. I think those countries will maintain an interest in trying to make some sort of a comeback in some form. Whether it happens sooner or later remains to be seen. But I do believe that even active combat is not necessarily complete just because Azerbaijan returned and liberated its territories. Also, the final status of Nagorno-Karabakh itself has not been negotiated in a very long-term settlement. The settlement the peace deal that was concluded has been questioned by all of the sides, actually. And many believe that this is not the permanent final negotiation settlement because some of the territorial issues have not been completely dealt with it. So from a diplomatic and political standpoint, there's definitely more work to be done. Now, the question of the Minsk Group, whether they should even be continued involved in any capacity with what is going on or what will transpire, whether it's a final settlement or not, that's a better question. As international organizations tend to go on mission creeps, even if their own mission has been apparently fulfilled or largely settled, they will find a way to continue surviving in one form because it means they do not want to lose influence, they don't want to lose money, they don't want to lose access. So they will find, rather than trying to be shut down, they will probably most likely look for some form to survive and continue its existence, whether in relation to this particular conflict or by finding some sort of another but related diplomatic role, claiming that the status of refugees has not been fully resolved, that there are long-term peace implications for the region, something or other. It will find a way to try to keep going, and especially given what we've discussed about the French role in this and the fact that Macron is looking for a personal vehicle to kind of propel himself to a position of influence vis-a-vis Germany. And Germany itself is looking, to enter the picture in a more active way. It's looking to project itself into the OSCE in general. We are going to see that there is a bureaucratic power struggle within the organization as a whole, and therefore different groups that otherwise should have no bearing on any reality are going to be finding a second breath of air as a result of these bureaucratic struggles for power, money, influence.
Thank you very much, Ms. Irina. So, as we speak, as everything's settled, okay, OSCE Minsk Group is here, and probably the long-term solution hasn't been found, but we were talking about the corridor that has been given to Azerbaijan through Armenia, and from that corridor, some people have speculated the possibility of a pipelines, a railway lines, the transportation routes, and other stuff. So how secure that road would be? Will it put all the security, all the pipelines under the direct influence of Russia or Armenia, or will it be free of influence? And which one would be more profitable, through the old route, meaning through the Georgia and Iran, or through the Armenia? Which one would be more profitable and strategically viable?
Oh, okay. So in terms of what do I think is actually going to happen? There's a lot of skepticism for using the corridor for that purpose. First of all, because there's a lot of skepticism about Russia's control over it, but also because other routes are currently not unprofitable, and there appears to be no direct reason dispense with them. So on the one hand, Azerbaijan has to pay a percentage to Iran for passing energy through it, and of course there are interests. There are many outside interests in having Azerbaijan not get too closely involved with Iran in general, not having to pay that tax. But on the other hand, that route is already well established. It doesn't require any further work. It's financially viable, and Iran sees Azerbaijan as a necessary trade partner despite political differences and various other issues. Iran also does not wish Turkey becoming too powerful in the region, and the primary beneficiary of the use of that corridor would be Turkey. Georgia would also be possibly not happy if the pipeline that runs through it would be completely discontinued, and there are questions of the viability of running more than one pipeline and building a new pipeline, which would take years on top of the one that's already existing, and alienating Georgia, and perhaps, giving it even more power to Russia and Iran as a result of alienating Georgia. So Iran would object to excessive use of that corridor other than for limited transportation and railway purposes. Turkey is the biggest enthusiast of that approach, but because in the ideal scenario for Turkey, its own influence in the region would be directly greater as a result of having this direct access. Now, what does that actually mean in terms of Russia's control over that region? I think at some point either Turkey and Russia would have to come to an agreement, or if control transitions to Armenia, Turkey and Armenia would have to find a way of settling their differences, which I don't really see as a very likely outcome in the near future. Now, anything is possible later, but as of this moment, it just does not seem to be the most likely outcome here. Turkey could certainly negotiate a deal with Russia, but due to their conflicting economic interests and political interests in the region, there's going to be some level of tension and distrust. Nevertheless, coupled with having to invest into building a new railways, new pipelines, all of that is not a very quick solution. So what we are looking at is something theoretical. A lot of people are skeptical about it. Now, as far as Azerbaijan itself, yes, it would benefit from this additional infrastructure, but is it worth the risk of engaging excessively with the Russians? And there seems to be a great deal of distrust among Azerbaijanis about Russia's peacekeeping role in the region, and I don't think anyone is particularly happy about the idea of Russians being the intermediary, is controlling this strategic corridor between Azerbaijan and Armenia. I think there's a lot of concern about this, and I think until this political issue is settled, the economic issues are not likely to be fully resolved.
Very much, Mr. Before we continue, we have received a good question from our viewer comment. So we will a little bit deviate from our main topic, a little bit, not too much. So Mehdi writes, I want to ask about prospective irregular warfare by Armenian side against Azerbaijan army, both to Patrick Walsh and Irina Tsukerman. If we shed light on segachronism, which I don't know what it means, but I can guess, which is on the rise again in Armenian society, can we expect flourishment of Armenian terrorism in Qarabağ and South Caucasus? So I think I understood the question, and I'm going to a little bit change it so it's easier. So can we see the nationalism rise in Armenia that we are seeing right now again, and see the rise of terrorism, especially taking into account that Armenia already has a long history of terrorist organizations and terrorism?
Armenia's at the crossroads. Funny, I was reading a book that was written about, I think 20 years ago. It was called Armenia at the Crossroads, but obviously it didn't sort of like go very far in the crossroads 20 years ago, but it really is at the crossroads now. And it's in a really fluid situation. We don't know if Pashinyan's going to survive. We don't know whether, the people who replace him will actually just bind Armenia closer to Russia. So we don't know these things, and it's very difficult to work out what their response will be. Yes, Armenia is, in some ways, is one of the greatest exponents of terrorism in the 20th century. The Tsarists certainly were very, I don't know, I use the word impressed, but impressed or unimpressed with the Armenians. They caused them more trouble, I think, than the Bolsheviks did in the decade before the revolution and other revolutionaries. So they have a long history, and they have Asala and all these other groups that they came up with, the Dashnaks and Hunchaks, sort of through their history. So yeah, they have a long tradition, and in fact, irregular warfare is the great talent of the Armenians. In fact, I think that's what undone them in a sense in the war itself, because they were confronted by a professional army waging a very conventional or technologically conventional form of warfare that they couldn't deal with. In the first war, when Azerbaijan was a rather dysfunctional state, irregular warfare won the day, but it didn't win the day when it was confronted by a purposeful state with a professional military. So, this is the form of warfare that the Armenians excel at, and I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't instances of terrorism and irregular warfare conducted within the territories of Azerbaijan, the recently won back territories. That wouldn't surprise me at all. I think the transition from war to politics is a very difficult one. We've experienced it here in Northern Ireland. It went on for a good 15, 20 years. After the Good Friday Peace Agreement, and there was constant, activity, guerrilla type activity, and various other types of forms of low-level warfare. So I think the situation is poised that way, and really it depends on what Armenia emerges out of this war. I think the pessimistic viewpoint, and probably the majority viewpoint amongst Azerbaijanis, is that it's going to be the same Armenia, and really, that security and all these aspects have to be kept up, and I totally agree with that. Optimistically, perhaps Armenia might change. I don't know. It's going to be a long process. I think there's a 5-year breathing space. I think that one of the if we look at the agreement positively, I think Russia provides certain advantages to Azerbaijan in the next 5 years. I mean, I can understand entirely this argument that people don't want the Russians in Karabakh. People don't want a Russian presence. I think the Armenians don't really want a Russian presence unless it's beneficial to them. But I can understand that entirely. But perhaps if we have to run with this now, it's a done deal. It's a reality. So what can Azerbaijan gain out of this? Well, the first thing it needs to do is reconstruct, and the reconstruction is the most important item on the agenda. Repopulating Karabakh, building a strong security presence there. That has to be done. And in fact, this 5 years with Russian forces there, basically managing the Armenian defeat, controlling the Armenians to an extent, perhaps trying to manipulate them as well, but controlling them. That's a good thing, to be honest. It's a good thing. And it gives Azerbaijan the opportunity to basically put all its resources in the reconstruction of Karabakh. And that's the most important thing Azerbaijan needs at the present minute. This is going to be an immensely difficult process, immensely difficult, far more difficult than winning this war, far more difficult. And it's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to divert resources and things like this. But, Azerbaijan people want this, and I can understand that. But, so there's a 5-year breathing space. at the end of 5 years, 2025, then there's a very interesting situation developing, about what the attitude is to the Russians. This is really the most difficult thing. And I don't know, I don't really want to speculate on what's going to happen, because a lot depends on the Armenian attitude, the Russian attitude, and all Azerbaijan can do is try and play this as politically astutely as possible and try to project friendly relations while maintaining strong security measures against any Armenian resurgence that's attempted. And I think that's all can be done at this present minute in time.
I would add to that the Armenian nationalism, or rather the extreme form of it, there's nothing wrong with nationalism for any nation, but this extreme and biased and anti-whoever form of nationalism predates this conflict. It predates the creation of the modern state of Armenia. It predates even the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, there's been tensions between Armenians and other groups that go back to the 19th century and earlier, throughout wherever they were. They've had that ideology is deeply rooted, and it's not going to be too quick to root out and to change, even in the best case scenario. It's something that goes back centuries, not just decades. And it's something that's been built upon by various movements and influences. And it's just, today there's in the modern world, people are, trying to negotiate peace and to become more open-minded and whatever. But if you tend to live a certain way, it's kind of the tradition of thinking will bear past all other influences, external possibilities, and even access to other information that would challenge your views. And that's my concern. Now, in terms of Russia, there's two ways this can go about happening. Russia, a few ways actually. One, Russia essentially maintains some level of control. Ultimately, it doesn't want to get too overly involved and get into another bigger confrontation with Turkey or whoever else in the region. It just wants to maintain its own interests, business interests, cultural influence, and so forth. And eventually, it works out some sort of an economic arrangements with all the parties involved and plays a limited role that people may not altogether like, but it's not ultimately a direct threat. That's the best case scenario, with Russia remaining in the region. Second possibility, Russia goes full control mode and completely subsumes Armenia as a whole, which seems very likely at the moment, and starts pressuring for additional concessions over time. Now, it has also, on the one hand, it gained a lot by becoming part of a formal arrangement and maintaining control over territories. On the other hand, Turkey has also gained a lot, and it also will not necessarily want Russia infringing on its influences. So we can see some sort of a political battle of wills down the road, with Armenia playing a very minor role of a tool. It's a possibility that in the future Russia may weaponize Armenians once again against Azerbaijan for the sake of pushing back against Turkey, not so much Azerbaijan itself. That is something to be wary about and watch out for. Third possibility, Russia, for various reasons, may not wish to engage in any further confrontations past a certain point, and it will essentially be done with Armenia, except for various, military base arrangements it already has. It will wish to have a very limited symbolic presence, with the exception of some economic deals and arrangements, and will turn its attention to other territorial interests elsewhere. And if the Armenian ideological issue is not in some way addressed by that point, if that happens, there is a great risk that Armenian terrorist groups that are not fully controlled or under the control by the state at all will not only research, but will globalize with other groups and interests, the way we have seen with other national, with other territorial conflicts. We have seen that with IRA in the past, making allies with the Palestinian rebels, with various other groups in other parts of the world. When a conflict of that sort becomes globalized, that is a major security issue for everybody involved, for the Armenian state, for Azerbaijan, for Russia, for Turkey, even potentially for Iran, even if Iran is part of that arrangement. So if that happens, and if that gets out of control, the region may end up in a great deal of turmoil. You may see very strange political arrangements being made to combat this terrorist threat. A lot of where that's going to go also depends on other factors. Armenian state is very poor. It's in no condition to sponsor formal fighting at this moment. The military is going to be spending time on trying to rebuild. If there's a very strong nationalist push, it will be investing more into the military, into rebuilding its military. It may not be in full control of minor groups, but it also won't necessarily directly spend resources on weaponizing them. At the same time, the issue is whether the Armenian diaspora abroad will be sponsoring these groups. And it depends a lot on the legal status of their major lobbies and funding mechanisms in the United States and France. So I would actually watch very carefully what happens in the US and in France with those lobbies. If there's any form of potential radicalization, they may play a great part if they remain as powerful as they are at the moment.
Thank you very much, Irina. Thank you, Patrick. So I hope Mehdi is satisfied with our answer. What I was about to say, yeah, of course. Mr. Patrick, I have read your blog, and you have suggested that a Russian presence in the area will disrupt the natural assimilation process between two nations, and this was the way, the only possible way of settling this conflict, that two nations beginning to live side by side and getting to know each other much better, general assimilation, right? So here's my question comes. The USSR period was exactly that, but why did it work? And why it will work this time if it happens under Azerbaijan rule?
Well, one of the sort of let me put it like this: that one of the most brutal things to say about this conflict is, and it's not probably a very nice thing to say after victory and obviously the great feeling of relief felt in Azerbaijan, but actually one of the things that Azerbaijan has won is a national problem. Because there is obviously a nationality issue in Karabakh or Nagorno-Karabakh, because there are two nations that live there. No matter what we might argue about history and who was there in 1820 or who was there before or whatever, really from this time onwards, certainly there were two nations or two national groupings in Karabakh. So, what is the solution to this national problem? If we look at the solutions that have been tried in the past, the Armenian solution in 1994 was quite simple. It was to get rid of the other national grouping, which was the Azerbaijanis. So they essentially ethnically cleansed the entire region. But, it didn't work. It seems like a surgical solution to a national problem, get rid of the other nation. But it didn't work, and they're back to square one again. When the Azerbaijanis come back, there will be the same problem. I think, a lot of things really have been said by Armenians about Stalin, and obviously Stalin isn't the most popular man in the world, but he was confronted with exactly the same problem in 1920. And his solution was to set up this autonomous region, but keeping Karabakh within the Azerbaijan state. I think this was certainly that was the right decision to make. There's other aspects of this settlement that obviously people in Azerbaijan would be very hostile to. But, the idea of autonomy was probably the right one at the time. it is a national problem. It's a nationality issue, and it's a very difficult thing to know how to deal with it. I think that, how do you actually develop an enduring settlement? Well, unfortunately, from my experience of living in Northern Ireland, we have a nationality problem here, right? About half our population believe they're British. Half our population believe they're Irish. And we live in the same territory. We're not dissimilar than Karabakh. In fact, the main difference between us and Karabakh is the fact that I come from the Catholic community, the Irish Catholic community, and we were never ethnically cleansed from Ulster. So we remained. It would be a bit like if the Armenians had won the war in 1994, but the Azerbaijani population had remained. In a sense, we're like the Azerbaijanis in that situation. So the problem that remained for us was that we were kept under the heel, so to speak. We were badly treated. We were second-class citizens, and that resulted in a 28-year conflict. Irina mentioned the IRA and and things like this. It was a very serious conflict. You can remember times when 5 bombs went off in Belfast every day. It has been sorted out to an extent. It's not dead. It can reoccur, but to an extent, the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 did actually at least give us an enduring sense of peace. We've had 30 years of peace now. So how do you go about solving this problem in Karabakh? It's very difficult, because the initial problem is a security problem. It's a reconstruction problem. And really these other, the building of enduring peace and the enduring peace settlement will take a lot of time, 20 years time, I'd say, but then there'll probably have to be structures put together that would, basically get people to collaborate, to work together, to get communities to actually live side by side. That sounds like ridiculously optimistic at this present time. And possibly at this present time, it's a better solution that there's a sort of a partition and that there's walls and people are ringed off away from each other. That's probably better at this particular time. But there will be a time, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line, when there will have to be a wider sort of like settlement, or an internal settlement within Karabakh. And that's going to be a very difficult task. We went through this in Northern Ireland, and I can tell you it's a really difficult task, and there'll be lots of bad things will happen on the way. But really getting people to collaborate, getting good relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Turkey and Armenia, Russia and Armenia, Russia and Azerbaijan, Iran as well, or getting these good relations and interdependent relations, and really everybody benefiting in a settlement that everybody accepts is really the only way of conquering Armenian nationalism at the end of the day. Because unfortunately, it'll come back again and again and again, unless something else is developed. But it's a horrendously difficult job, I think this is going to be. And I'm not going to put forward a sort of like a model solution, which because every situation is different. But hopefully, you can work towards this, and hopefully that will, end this this Armenian obsession and this rather pariah type state that they have developed that really is no good. And unless they change their character, this is going to be a very difficult situation and a very difficult project. But we have to be optimists in these situations. If we don't, we just get the same thing again and again, and people dying and next generation dying, etc., etc. So we have to be optimists in this situation, I think.
I would add to that, actually, that without the information warfare element being, kind of being taken away from the table, without the ideological and educational changes, I don't really see a long-term solution. And unfortunately, Russia may not be directly involved in antagonizing any more direct combat for the time being, but they do have an incentive not to completely to direct Armenian nationalism, not against its own influence, but against Azerbaijan to some extent, and as a way of maintaining control in the region. And I don't think they're ready to relinquish that level of ideological control. And the problem is, I don't really see any movement against this sort of ideological, educational, media change. While this constant incitement is being fed into the minds literally from birth, and some of it comes from even outside the country, from the Armenian diaspora abroad, who are kind of sponsoring this ideology independently, many of them having even never been in the country itself. There is no real incentive to let go of this resentment. I mean, the ideology is so extreme that some of these Armenian nationalists don't believe that Azerbaijanis are even indigenous to the region. That level of extremism is what is ultimately preventing solution. People can have differences over politics, economy, territorial arrangements without actually completely dehumanizing the other side. But when they come to believe that the other side simply does not belong in the region at all, that there's some fake entity imposed from the outside, that's where you have a very long, protracted conflict which is very difficult to resolve. That element needs to be taken away in whatever form, and the only way to encourage that is to acknowledge that the other side, has a story that you may not like, but at least it has some historical presence that may be a challenge to you in some respect, but it's there. If they do not believe that Azerbaijanis are even from the region or people who have any rights at all, then there cannot really be a reckoning and any national conversation about how to deal with that. That is the obstacle that needs to be addressed by whomever. Until it is, there's not going to be any real changes.
Thank you very much. Actually, I want to comment on that as well, about the identity that they are saying. From my conversations with Armenians, I kind of get this picture that they don't have the understanding of mixture nations that Azerbaijan is. In a way, I kind of put Azerbaijan similar to the Belgian people, who are actually mixed between Celts and French-descended Flemings, I think, right? Walloons and Flemings, right? They're a mixture of Walloons and Flemings, and there's a Belgian nation. And I kind of put Azerbaijani as similar to that, mixture between Caucasian Albanians and Turks that's molded with Persian culture. I kind of put it like that. But it seems like for Armenians, there's one thing. You must be from the beginning. That's it. There is no thing. And I honestly have no idea or slightest idea how we can put forward this idea that there is a possibility of, and there are nations that are mixture, not like indigenous or something like that. Okay, so I now want to ask a question that would have a little bit of a historic background, let's say. We're seeing that Armenian diaspora is very powerful in modern world, in the West and in Western media, and as well as the information websites, from Britannica to Wikipedia to everywhere. And we can clearly see that they are either tampering with some information or hiding the others, trying to either create some story or deceive the story, deface the story, history, I mean. Okay, so how we can combat this issue, and will it be possible to reverse these effects of Armenian diaspora that has happened on the span of 30 years before?
In my personal opinion, from living to the US, it is possible to reverse, but it would mean collapse of certain institutions dedicated entirely to propaganda, harassment, and illicit funding of projects that are not purely humanitarian, educational, or aimed at, the improvement of the country. There's a lot of elements that are highly structured, well organized in the West, possibly coordinated between different elements of diaspora in different parts of the world. And definitely a lot of them are highly illegal. We've had the misfortune of experiencing some of these activities and their effects on us directly. They have a very structured online troll network that antagonizes and creates additional conflicts. Even if you have regular Armenians who might be willing to engage in some conversations, these trolls control online presence and they prevent regular people from being able to speak out and engage. I've offered Armenians space to put forward their own side of the story on our website. I've offered them an opportunity to engage larger regional issues and geopolitical concerns and possible solutions, so long I have no problem with engaging with anyone who is respectful and willing to contribute to conversation, even if they have disagreements. But they have not taken, none of them have been able to take us up on that offer. And I believe this, there is a level of control from the diaspora that actually contributes to a shutdown of internal discussion. That is something that needs to be challenged aggressively. They impose their will on outside communities, not just their own. They work to shut down dissent and criticism by others, to shut down media coverage that is not exactly 100% on board with the agenda. They even attacked Kim Kardashian for not going far enough in her level of support, despite her massive financial contribution, because they wanted to see more aggressive rhetoric from her and from other important members of the diaspora. So this is a level of authoritarian control coming from certain structures that is very counterproductive to any resolution, and it contributes to a reign of terror, I would say, across the board that keeps control, that infiltrates various institutions, that acts almost like a foreign fifth column that has very little to do with even what's going on inside Armenia itself. It's a self-perpetuating independent structure that has evolved from very entrenched ideological mentality, and that needs to be disrupted on an infrastructural level in order for people to start being able to breathe and to discuss with one another whether they're to break through the enchantment, so to speak. And by enchantment, I mean imposition of ideological conformity.
Thank you, Mr. Patrick.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good news has come out of the war with regard to the Armenian diaspora, and that's basically that they were thoroughly defeated. They were defeated on every front. They showed themselves up to be crazy, to be racists, to be basically promoting a society, as you said, that is mono-ethnic. And this doesn't play well at all in the West, this type of thing. It looks like National Socialism. So it's not at all. They had a very bad war, the Armenian diaspora. And from another point of view, I think actually the Russians were very pleased at how the Armenian diaspora looked so impotent in the war. And basically, they were put back in their place. They had a good first war. They had their heroes, Monty and all those characters who came and fought in the first war, and they were lionized. But, you know, the second war put them back in their place, which was they were just basically a gang of terrorists who showed up and had a good day. But, you know, the second war showed that they didn't matter as much. And the diaspora contributed very little to the second war efforts of the Armenian state. And, you know, it basically was beaten. And it was beaten in the information war, even though the Western media tended to pander to the Armenians as usual. But essentially, what we saw actually was a really big development, I thought. I had not been aware of the Azerbaijani diaspora before this war. And, you know, the events in July really, really mobilized the Azerbaijanis abroad. And they really combated effectively the Armenian diaspora. And they actually emerged as a sort of a diaspora not unlike the sort of Irish diaspora in America, which is a much more complex thing than the Armenians, and essentially has been good for America, very good for America, and very good for Ireland. It's highly regarded. The Azerbaijani diaspora is emerging a bit like this. It won't be as powerful as the Irish diaspora, obviously, but it has a different character than the Armenian diaspora. It is not an antagonistic, hateful, bitter, angry diaspora. And it actually achieved, by just taking to the streets, by having demonstrations, by establishing a presence in the West, by not letting the Armenians win the information war, it really did achieve something very, very big, I thought. And, this is very, very good news for Azerbaijan. And really, the country should be proud of its diaspora abroad. No country likes to lose people, but it was of great benefit in this war. And I think the good news coming out of the war is that the Armenians didn't have it their own way in the West for the first time, and they actually suffered a really big defeat. I think, there has to be a lot of work has to be done, but actually not the same sort of work that the Armenians do. A more complex, a more heterogeneous sort of society, liberal, more, outgoing, diverse, which is the character of Azerbaijan. That just has to be projected, because the United States, Russia, they like this to an extent. They want this, especially in the West. This is the future in the West. So, Azerbaijan has advantages in this area if its diaspora gets well organized and maintains this ability to counteract the Armenians, because they're not as strong as people think they are. A lot of people in other societies don't like them, basically. They're not liked in a lot of places. People said to me, "Oh, we haven't got a Kim Kardashian." Well, who would want a Kim Kardashian? Everybody laughs at Kim Kardashian all over the world. It's just, the Azerbaijan, had a very good war abroad, and its diaspora is really a credit to the people at home.
Thank you very much. So I have last two questions. After that, I would like to end this webinar. So one question will be to both of you, but especially for Mrs. Irina, and the other one will be especially for Mr. Patrick. Okay. So, Mr. Irina, you talked about Iran and how Iran is going to be affected by all of this. And very interesting, the recent thing, after the Erdogan speech, that caused the havoc in Iran, the poem that Erdogan said, it caused the havoc in the poem. And it resulted in a very, very sharp reaction of Iran. We haven't seen such reaction even when their scientists got killed, which was a little bit funny to think about. So why it sort of gave this stark reaction, and it kind of seemed like it is their main weakness or something.
It is a major weakness for Iran, and it's actually at the core of the ongoing tensions between Turkey and Iran. These two countries have been cooperating on many issues for many years, but at the same time, there are also ideological and geopolitical differences that make a complete alliance and impossible. And down the road, they're inevitably going to run into disputes. They're able to cooperate even on ideological and religious issues, despite being very religiously different countries. But on some things are beyond that. And Azerbaijan and Caucasus is one of those places where those interests collide. They both view this general area as their sphere of influence. Iran has significant diasporas in Georgia, and they have a great deal of tourism in Azerbaijan, and they view Azerbaijan a place they would like to be more influential. On the one hand, on the one hand, they have a challenge of their own, ethnic challenge of having 30 to 40 million Azerbaijanis, and that's just considering Azerbaijanis who are not mixed with other cultures, just purely ethnically Azerbaijani. And that is a challenge. On the one hand, they're major bulwarks of the institutions of the military. On the other hand, they maintain their own linguistic and cultural identity, which runs contrary to the Islamist revolutionary principles and challenges the state and its very nature. Many of them are still attached to Azerbaijani identity politically as well. They feel like Azerbaijan has been broken up due to Iranian annexation and interference and involvement even before the Islamic revolution. So for Iran, Azerbaijan is an opportunity and a challenge. At the same time, as a secular Shia state, Azerbaijan feels like, on the one hand, they have more of a right to it, a religious legacy to maintain, and at the same time, they feel helpless and irritated by the fact that Azerbaijan is pursuing its own tradition, that it's not following Iran's dominant model of Khomeini's Shia Islam that it seeks to impose globally. So that's a challenge. On the other hand, Azerbaijan is ethnically closer to Turkic peoples, including Turkey, and they have had close cultural and trade and other relations with Turkey preceding all of these events. Going back to the Ottoman Empire, they've had relations. There's the Qajar dynasty in Iran was Turkic. All of that is a challenge to the mainstream ideological conformist line that the regime is pushing out. And Erdogan's visit to Baku kind of rubs them the wrong way because it reiterates all these differences. This is right now not even about Erdogan personally and his own policies and his own more aggressive political position of Turkey as a state. This also goes deeper, and had there been, it actually antagonizes them more that a leader with whom they've had somewhat of a better working relationship than with some leaders in the past is sending a very public message of support to Azerbaijanis in this way when Iran is also facing challenges from the West and all these other things. So they saw it as a hostile gesture, as a potential challenge, and they were not necessarily incorrect.
Thank you very much. Actually, that was the fair point you have touched about the Qajar dynasty and its origins, and it's very funny to see how the historians in modern Iran and their version of a history is starkly different from the version of the Persian scholars that are outside of Iran. They ran during the Qajar dynasty's fall, they ran away, so the version of history is completely different. They say it's Turkic, but current Iranian doesn't say. Which brings me to the next question that I'm going to ask to Mr. Patrick about the general historical disarray that's happening in Azerbaijan. Now, we know that Azerbaijan right now, most of its historical accounts are either in Azerbaijani or in Russian, and none of them has been properly translated or properly researched at best. So, as a historian, what can you tell how Azerbaijan can mobilize its forces to reinitiate its history, bring its history to the world with a proper evidence? Because in my own research, I saw that most of the manuscripts that are in Azerbaijan, that were in Azerbaijan, were either destroyed during all the way from Mongol raids to the Russian raids, or just lost at the time. So how we can mobilize it? Is it an institutionalist work, or can the aspiring lone historians can do it on their own?
Well, I think you do point to a problem. I know from my own experience, when I came to Azerbaijan in 2018, I knew a little bit about the situation, and but I was surprised at my own ignorance. I went up to Guba, and I saw a lot of the documentation, and in Baku, and well, what it told me, I mean, what it told me is that people in the West are very, very ignorant of Azerbaijan's history. They virtually know nothing, and in a sense, that was one of the reasons why I decided to write a book, because I realized that Azerbaijan had a very good case in its history, and essentially it just wasn't in the West. It just wasn't there. And of course, you might say, well, does it really matter? But well, it does, because the English language is really the default language of history and politics, really, in the world. So, and the Armenians know that very well. It is a problem, and it's obviously it's a historical thing, because Azerbaijan was cut off from the West. It was part of the Soviet Union for so long. If you compared Turkish history to the writing of Turkish history to the writing of Azerbaijani history, you will see how much more there has been written about Turkey in the Ottoman times and everything than there has been from Azerbaijan. So when I was studying the Armenian issue, there was massive amounts of research done in the English language from the Turkish perspective and the Armenians, but there was very little available from the Azerbaijan case. So this was a problem, and I think it is being rectified at the present minute, and it does need, in a sense, sort of collaboration between people, scholars that need to work together. And maybe the Azerbaijanis have obviously the great advantage of being able to speak their own language and understand everything in their archives, but you probably need help with from people from the West about how things should be written, in the sense that, because obviously, history is to an extent propaganda. It's, we can't get away from that. It's a story that has to be told. If you try to tell a sort of a completely factual story, people are not really that interested. So, the Armenians realize this very, very much. So the Azerbaijanis have to get their case out into the world. And, this is a fantastic opportunity to do so after the war, when people have developed an interest. How can it be done? Well, it just has to be done, exactly as I say, through sort of collaboration, through working together, through building up networks, through, really talking to other historians from around the world who might make connections between certain events. I found myself, when I was at the conference, I thought that the understanding of British foreign policy was a little bit, let's just put it like this, it was a little bit Soviet in a sense. It was like, this is imperialism, British imperialism, this is economics and all this. The subtleties of why Britain was in Azerbaijan and why it left Azerbaijan suddenly were a little bit lost. I noticed this, that obviously being from Ireland, I can understand Britain far more than people from Azerbaijan, who understand probably Russia a lot better than I do. So, I think it has to come about through sort of collaboration, through people working together, for people putting ideas across, different cultures within, helping out each other, and obviously that would involve some sort of funding and exchange types of things, and development of universities, working with Western institutions that were friendly. And things like this. I think this is the only way. And then sort of top class type of histories and books are written in English, that are put onto the Western market, and basically put Azerbaijan's case out there in a really readable, in a very, interesting way that has been done for Turkey, but not so much for Azerbaijan. So I think that's the solution to the problem. But again, it's another work in progress. It's another difficult thing that will take decades, to accomplish.
How much government should put into it, like support? How much government support is needed? Is it actually even needed or not?
Oh, I think it definitely does. It is needed. I think a lot of complaints I've heard even from Turkey is that the Turkish government doesn't put enough resources into defending its case. I've heard this story. So, I mean, I presume the same would be true of Azerbaijan. The government does need to engage in this type of thing. I think, when I look back even at when I was invited to the conference in 2018. I mean, I would have not written one word in support of Azerbaijan if I hadn't come to Baku in 2018 and I hadn't been treated so well by the Academy of Sciences and I hadn't met all these Azerbaijani historians and people I talked to and had a very good time in Baku. If I hadn't have experienced that, I would never have written one word for Azerbaijan, I mean, I think that's just a small example of how important these exchanges and sort of like, visits and things are, because they bring in people that are interested and will help. And the same thing, they'll help us understanding. And, Turkish people said to me they didn't know much about Azerbaijan's history. And they were very surprised when they read things I'd written about Azerbaijan. These are Turkish historians that said the same thing. So it shows you that the problem is a universal problem, really,
True, it's really strange with Turks as well. I mean, even their history books have some strange accounts of our history that when I was reading, I was like, wait, that can't be true. And then I double checked with Russians and so, no, our account is true. It's something wrong with theirs. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Irina Tsukerman and Mr. Patrick Walsh. We have had actually an amazing webinar, and I believe our viewers just loved it as well. Do you want to say something for the end?
Well, I very much appreciate this opportunity. I appreciate this great conversation with Dr. Walsh. It was enlightening for me, very thought-provoking. I'm going to take a look and try to find a copy of that book and read it for my own education as well. I hope you'll be able to also share the link to this event afterwards for those who missed it.
Yes, sure.
And I think this is a great model to engage people in conversations and bring up these issues, because let's face it, many people may be wary of watching documentaries online because they're afraid, what if it's inaccurate? They may be wary of reading or just don't have time to read a lot. But when they see people engage in discussions, that opens them to seeing different perspectives and feeling like they can participate in the conversation, ask questions, raise issues, and actually come to some level of understanding through these different perspectives being brought together. I think this is a great idea for the future and I hope you continue with that model.
Dr. Walsh?
Yeah, I'd like to thank you as well for this opportunity. I think it was a very good and enlightening conversation, and I learned a lot from what Irina said, and it's really good to hear people's perspectives from different places in the world, because obviously people from Ukraine will have a very different understanding of things than people from Ireland and Azerbaijan and Turkey, etc., etc. So, I'm very happy to have participated in this, and as I said, it is a model for going forward. And I mean, to anybody from Azerbaijan, I'd like to say I'm really looking forward to seeing you again when the COVID thing is all over and I can walk down the streets of Baku. Thank you.
Absolutely, same here. I agree with that.
Thank you very much again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.